This episode may contain sensitive language not suitable for children. Hello, and welcome back to Season 2 of Through Black Eyes Unfiltered, the podcast that brings truth to light. Listen to present-day historical events that shaped our history and will determine our future, as presented by moderator Raymond Dunn and expert Marvin Dunn. I'm Dr. Raymond Dunn, and I'm the author of 2 children's storybooks. My first storybook is The Little Scrub Christmas Tree. It's the story of a little tree that finds itself growing up in a Christmas tree forest. In the story, I have embedded many lessons that young children might learn that will help them as they mature. My second book is The Robin That Could Not Sing. And this is the story of a little bird that tried very hard to be like all of the other birds. And there are also lots of lessons involved in this book that young children might pick up as they read the story that would help them in their everyday lives and other obstacles that might come their way. Episode 5. I'm Dr. Raymond Dunn.
I'm Dr. Marvin Dunn.
And in this episode, we will discuss the history of slavery in Florida.
Absolutely. And it's a very, very dark history that's not very well known. I've done a lot of research on slavery in Florida, and I've included that in my books. So let's get started.
All right. We're off to the races. Marvin, how did slavery start in Florida?
Well, let's go back to the beginning of the enslavement of Africans being brought to the New World,
Okay.
to get a wider view. In the 1400s, the Portuguese arrived on the coast of Africa, east coast of Africa, and began bringing Africans to Europe, sort of like as oddities. And they would take these people, these Africans, to the courts of the kings and the royalty of Europe. Mm-hmm. So if you had one of these slaves standing there in leopard skin with a big fan waving to keep you cool, that was a sign of status, of being worldly. Oh. So kings and potentates of various kinds in Europe wanted these slaves. They were enslaved. Africans brought to them just so they can show out. And they'd have also, animals, leopards, and whatever that they bring in from the dark continent. There were no plantations in Europe. They didn't need slaves to work. It was just for show. Then Europeans got a taste for sugar. Originally, the common folk did not have access to sugar. Just the very rich people had sugar. And once the New World was discovered, and they found out that sugarcane grew so abundantly, particularly in the Caribbean, that if these slave plantations were established because they would need labor to produce sugar such that they have a commercial enterprise.
Right.
But they needed labor to do that, and the labor was not available in Europe, and they needed land to be able to plant enough sugarcane to feed the demand for sugar in Europe. So that was the reason that European investors in France, in England, in America ultimately, started putting money into these ships.
So this whole nasty taste of our black history began with the sweet taste of sugar.
You could not have put it better. Absolutely. Then the other thing that added to that, to the really the impetus of slavery in our country, was cotton. Europeans wanted to start having clothes and bedding made of cotton. So you had the demand for this particular product, also the problem of not having sufficient land in Europe to grow cotton fields. The New World provided the land they needed, and Africa provided the slaves. So first sugar and then cotton. And with those two enterprises, there was enough money to be made to enrich the thrones of all the major powers in Europe.
So how were they able to get as many Africans as they needed from all these tribes spread it all over the place? They just walked in and took them themselves?
Well, they started doing that.
Okay.
At first, the Europeans would land on the coast, and they would send parties inland to collect slaves. Now, the Africans didn't just say, come on in and take our people. They resisted this.
Right.
So a lot of Europeans got killed trying to collect slaves themselves in the interior. So what the Europeans did was to build what they call barracoons, or slave forts, on the coast of Africa, on the east coast of Africa. And then they used African kings and chiefs and queens to bring the slaves to them. So in Africa, all of a sudden, with the arrival of the Europeans and the demand for slaves, for the reasons I just told you, it was not credible. It was not correct. It was not possible for the Europeans themselves to bring in enough slaves to fill these slave forts. So these kingdoms, and most of the major kingdoms in Africa, certainly in Central Africa, participated in this. They started raiding each other. Your tribe raids my tribe raids yours. We both together raid somebody else, and collecting men at first, young men. And these different kingdoms in Africa will then march these slaves to the coast and trade for them. That's basically what the African leaders wanted for these millions of people that they sold. Two things mainly. They wanted horses. They particularly wanted Arabian stallions.
Right.
Because having horses meant you had more power. You could then move through the countryside, collecting slaves, using their horses for all kinds of military ventures. So kings and queens who had horses were more powerful. The other thing that they got was guns. They got guns.
And that changed a whole lot of things in Africa.
It changed warfare in Africa. Before the Europeans arrived with guns, you get into a dispute with another tribe, you all square off on the field, we throw spears at each other, one or two folks might get hit, and that's the end of the war. But then here comes weapons of mass destruction in Africa. And those chiefs and kings and queens who had European weapons were able to dominate other tribes and collect people and bring them in to be sold.
Now, give us some idea of the number of people we're talking about who were forced into slavery from Africa.
Well, there are varying estimates about that, but most of the people who've looked at this in great detail by looking at the manifests of ships during this period, we've concluded that about 10 to 12 million were taken. And of those, about 1.5 million died on the way here during what was called the Middle Passage.
Exactly.
But about that number were taken. And now listen, most of the slaves who were taken were not brought to America. Actually, during the whole period of slavery, only 388,000 slaves were brought directly to America. They were taken to South America.
The islands, right?
Well, Brazil, South America, Central America, and of course the Caribbean. Many of them to Haiti, Santo Domingo, Cuba. Oh man, Cuban slavery was incredibly brutal and vicious.
So what was so different about that?
They'd work the slaves to death in the sugar fields and then just leave them because there was an inexhaustible supply of Africans. They would put 100 slaves in a sugarcane field, and 2 or 3 months later, most of them would be dead.
Before we start talking further about life after arriving here, describe for our listeners what it was like in the Middle Passage aboard the ships and how they were stored.
Well, let's start with why it was called the Middle Passage.
Okay.
It was the middle part of the trip that the slave ships took. These ships would leave Europe with goods, guns, cookware, kitchen stuff that people really wanted, beads, decorative stuff, all kinds of manufactured goods, pots and pans and whatever, knives that Africans would want. They'd leave Europe with these manufactured goods, go to Africa, trade those goods for people at these so-called barracoons on the coast, where some of the slaves had to wait for weeks from the time they got to the coast. They put them in these, they call them slave pens, where you just had to wait until the Goree Island was the most famous of them. Barack Obama went there, but many American presidents have gone to Goree Island in Senegal because that was one of the major points from which they sent slaves to the New World, Goree Island. But you could languish at Goree Island for 2 or 3 weeks, a month or so, by the time they got enough slaves to fill a particular order. And then you were taken aboard the slave ship. And now, Ray, there were a lot of problems with trying to bring these people here on slave ships. For one thing, there was always a problem of insurrection, a mutiny.
Exactly.
Right. So as they brought the women and children on board, they would leave them more or less on the deck, topside, not necessarily chained down below, but as they brought men on board, they were put on the bottom level of the ship. And imagine a slave ship sort of like a multi-layered cake. We have several layers from the top deck down to the bottom deck. And Ray, the average amount of space between the decks was 4 feet. So you couldn't sit up. And these trips from Africa could take 2 months or more. So imagine you're taken down to the lowest level of the ship, the bottom of the ship, particularly where they thought the bad, niggas needed to be, get chained together, spoon fashion. You'll end up with another guy spoon fashion,
right.
shackled to a post so you can't get up and walk around. And what do you do when you got to go to the bathroom?
You just lay there.
Yeah, no, you don't just lay there. You go.
Exactly.
So here you are, A month earlier, you were hunting lions on the savannah in Africa, and now you're laying in your own excrement or someone else's for 6 weeks.
And for those who died as they were laying there chained, is it true that what the whites would do was just unchain them, throw them overboard for shark bait?
Yes, that is. They would discard dead slaves over the side. The ship's general manager had to keep a record of the slaves that died, because they had to account to the insurance company when they got to wherever they were going or what have you. So they kept a record of how many were lost during the course of the passage. One of the problems, Ray, with people dying on board during the Middle Passage, was that the slave ship crews, about 30 men, constituted the crews of the average slave ship. They didn't like going down into the hold. It was nasty. That's mainly, it smelled bad, particularly the lower you go. So sometimes a slave might die on a Monday, but it might be Wednesday or Thursday before they would come down and get the body. So you're chained to a body for 3 days until they finally come down and remove the corpse. The greatest risk that the slaves had was just disease. Obviously, dysentery was really, really bad. People just got very, very sick. Some committed suicide. They had this practice they called, on board slave ships, they called dancing the slaves. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I've never heard of dancing the slaves.
Well, some of these ships had 500 people enslaved. They knew that when they got to Cuba, or wherever they were going to go, but wherever they were heading, that these slaves, if they were sick, emaciated, crippled, scarred up, they wouldn't bring as much money. So one of the reasons that they would bring the slaves up, they would rotate them up to the top deck to get exercise, to jump around, and then they take them back and chain them up again. But you have a good chance of every 2 or 3 days of coming up on deck to be danced, as they called it. But it wasn't to give the slaves entertainment. Mm-hmm. It was to try to have them better able to sell once you got to the marketplace.
Right. Now, by some account, more slaves died during the Middle Passage than people died in the Holocaust. Is there any facts or documentation to support that?
I wouldn't get into that kind of a debate, bro. They were both horrendous acts against humanity. Mm-hmm. If you looked at the sheer number of people who were killed, probably there are more Jews. There were probably more Jews destroyed in Europe than there were black people who were destroyed during the Middle Passage or even during slavery in our country. So, but I've heard that debate back and forth, but I think there's no point in trying to weigh which one was worse. They were both incredibly inhumane.
Moving up further, give us some idea of how much a slave was worth, the value of a person.
Well, that depended.
Men, I would assume, were more valuable than females.
At first, in the first few hundred years or so, the men were more valuable because they could deliver the work that was needed. Mm-hmm. But a slave who had no training, no language development towards English or even pidgin English, straight off the slave ship, on the block, 16, 17 years old, healthy, no scars on his back.
Kunte Kinte.
Yeah, a good example.
Okay.
Would probably go for about $1,500 to $1,600 in those days. Now, if he had training, and we'll talk about the slave owner Zephaniah Kingsley in Florida who did this, some slave traders would train their slaves in carpentry or blacksmithing or some other desired craft, and then would demand more money for that person once that person was sold, and they got it.
So describe for us the ideal slave that they would be looking for.
Well, that changed over time. But initially, they were looking for men, boys. The ideal slave would have been an Igbo slave from that particular tribe. They were the blackest of the Africans. Slave owners wanted their workers to be as black as possible. There was a view that the blacker the slave was, the more work you would get out of him.
The blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice.
So they wanted Igbos. Mm-hmm. Average age 16 to 18. A slave who was 23 or 24 was really old. The average amount of time the slave would live to work would be about 5 years, and then he would be dead. But so initially, they wanted men, boys and men. That changed over time. In 1807, it became illegal to bring slaves into the United States. It was illegal to bring them into England even before that. England had passed a law that made the transatlantic slave trade illegal. So after 1807, you couldn't bring slaves into the United States except in violation of the law. Mm-hmm. And a great many slave traders did that. The United States had no way of enforcing the Anti-Slave Trade Act. We were a young country, had no navy, so you pass a law saying you cannot bring slaves across the Atlantic into the United States. How are you going to enforce that?
Well, it would appear that if you can't bring any more in, but the labor is needed, that's going to lead to breeding your own.
Yeah, exactly. So now they stop bringing in primarily men. They start bringing in women and girls and even children, because now, particularly right before the laws were passed against the slave trade, so 1801, 1800, 1805, in those years, they really went out and got a lot of women and children, so that once it became illegal, you could breed your own slaves. I read a lot about how these women had to come across during the Middle Passage. We can talk about that if you want, but I had no idea how much sexual attack, how much raping took place of these women during the Middle Passage, until I really started looking at how it was all put together. If you were a white man on a cruise ship, one of the 30 men running the slave ship, one of your perks was to be able to have any slave woman you wanted during the course of the 6 weeks passage. So you could just unchain some woman. Often the females weren't chained at all to begin with, but just take somebody to your little cubby hole someplace and rape them. And some of these females were mere children, 12, 13, 14-year-old children. Slave ship captains would take a concubine, one woman or two, to his cabin for the whole trip, and that would be her role for those 8 weeks, serve the captain. So the amount of sexual abuse during the Middle Passage needs to be better documented than I can, but it was horrendous. For the most part, the women didn't have underclothes. Some of them were naked, so they were very vulnerable to these men.
Okay, so with the need for this labor, what was the impetus for writing a law that would prevent it? Now, was that coming from the North as opposed to the South and its need for labor? Where was that support?
I mean, what really led to the laws outlawing the slave trade?
Yeah, because, obviously, here in the South, the plantation owners were trying to get more and more and more. So who came up with this idea of, okay, let's stop this?
Well, in the United States, the one group can be identified as having been on board early for trying to get rid of slavery in this country and the slave trade itself were Quakers. They were organized as a religion, even though the early Quakers did have slaves in our country, but over a period of time, the church decided that slavery was wrong. So some of the most organized efforts to stop slavery in our country came from Quakers. But you also had pressure coming from the wider church, the Catholic Church, the Pope. Going back to misuse of slaves in Cuba, the church issued a mandate telling slave owners in Cuba you could not abuse slaves the way that they were being abused in Cuba. So the church stepped in and made the argument to Catholic slave owners, you have a responsibility towards your slaves. You cannot abuse them. You can't make them work more than a certain number of hours. You can't give them more than a certain number of lashes. So here you have the church stepping in, trying to exert some moral authority on slavery, having given colonists to it for quite a number of years before that.
Now, that opens up a whole new conversation. You've got Africans being transported here. They had their own culture, their own religion back in Africa, and all of a sudden they arrive here, and they are faced with the white man's religions.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So how did black people as a whole, from slavery up until now, all of a sudden just change from the religions that they were accustomed to in Africa?
That's a great question, Brian.
Catholics and Protestants.
You know, Ray, a third of the slaves that landed in America were Muslims. I didn't know that. Even before the United States was established as a nation, and we had slaves coming in here earlier than the country's birth, obviously, a third of them were Muslims. If you go to some of the old slave cemeteries, like the ones among the Geeches and the Barry Islands of South Carolina and other places, in the slave graveyards, you'll see Islamic writings and symbols showing that even though these people were enslaved in South Carolina or in Georgia, when they died, they insisted, or those who buried them indicated that their true religion was Islam. But listen, brother, the Catholic Church rationalized its involvement in slavery by saying this. The Africans are savages. They're heathens. They need to be civilized. They need to be brought to Christ. So a slave owner had a responsibility to convert his slaves to Christianity. The church said, if you want to sleep well at night and use slaves, then you got to give something back to the church. That is bringing these people into the Christian church, and the Catholic Church in particular.
So that's how blacks then basically got their religion that they would practice and their names, right? Because,
No, two different things. Let's just talk about why are so many black people in America today Baptist and Methodist as opposed to something else.
Okay, but I got a two-part question.
Okay.
That's the first part. But were they also required to take the names or the name of their slave master? Because if the slave master was Williams, then what you refer to as Williams.
All right, let's take that as a separate question.
Okay.
The folks who came here on those slave ships had names. Mm-hmm. They had names, but once they got here and were purchased by somebody, that buyer had the right to name the slave whatever he wanted to. So you could be Akeem, Abdul, somebody one day, and then once you step off that ship and somebody buys you, you're now John from now on. And all of your African identity is gone. Your name is John. So one of the things these Africans lost that we need to dwell on a little bit more is their identity, their individual identity.
Okay, but the basis of my question is the last name. So now you became
yes.
you became John, but if I'm the plantation master and my last name is Dunn,
you're John Dunn.
You became John Dunn.
That's
and
correct.
You became Marvin Dunn.
That's correct.
And from then on, your children are Dunns, and
that's how we got named.
Okay,
exactly. You know, there was a tendency to sort of not change the name so much of female slaves, but male slaves were more often subject to name changes once they were bought. Now, it was a two-part question. Mm-hmm. What was the other question? The other part of the question?
It had to do with the religion.
Oh, yes. If you were a slave in Florida, it's probably true in the other states as well, the master made you go to church, even when there were not black churches. And Florida didn't have a black pastor until after the Civil War. The master would make you go to church. They would send people to wake the slaves up on Sunday morning. You go to church, and often the slaves sat down front. Right down front. They wanted to make sure that the slaves heard the message from the pulpit. And the message from the pulpit for the slave was very consistent. Obey your masters and your mistresses. It's what God wants you to do. You will have a reward in heaven. The more you work and suffer on earth, the greater will be your reward one day in heaven. And that was the drumbeat that slaves got from the church from the very beginning. And they identify themselves religiously with their masters, and most of the white people in the South were Baptist or Methodist.
And many of the earliest songs that slaves sung, like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," I would assume came from that kind of indoctrination of God will give you a better life afterwards.
Yeah.
So you work all day long for years and years on the plantation, and one day Swing Low, Sweet Chariot will pick you up and take you to this place.
Well, no, don't you? You would be taken up into the clouds to sit at the feet of God. You'll drink milk and honey forever, and you'll walk on streets paved with what?
Gold.
Who says heaven has to be that? Would you want to drink milk and honey forever? Or walk on gold forever?
Well, I would rather have my gold out here on earth, quite frankly.
That was right. Why didn't some slaves say to the master, to the pastor, well, you all are getting your rewards right now. Well, how can you all get yours now and we got to wait for ours?
Exactly.
But that's how religion was used against the people. And there were ways that the slaves tried to get around that by incorporating some of their own beliefs into Christianity and the songs and whatever as you've said. But it was a very orchestrated process of trying to remove the religious beliefs that slaves had before they landed and instill Christianity.
Okay, so I have two questions for you. I think one is going to lead into the other. Tell us this thing about the big gun. And then secondly, tell us, why didn't slaves, you may want to reverse this, why didn't slaves leave the plantation?
Well, let's start with that. Particularly during the Civil War. The white men are gone. They left. Mr. Charlie went to fight the Union. And you have 150 slaves on the plantation, but just the white women.
Still working.
So why didn't they take off? Why didn't everybody just, hey, the boss man isn't here, let's go. It's easy to say in 2019, if I had been a slave, I would have run. If I had been a slave, they wouldn't have kept me on. Yes, they would have. Yes, they would have. Listen, your grandmama was there. Your mama was there.
Your great-grandma.
They're buried on the ground that you have lived on all of your life. You have a wife and children on that plantation.
And besides that, you never been off the plantation. You don't know what's across
Don't know
the
what's
hill.
out there in the wilderness of Florida. Just go take off. No. There were folks who did run, particularly if there was an underground railroad pathway that came near where they lived. But most of the slaves stayed on the plantations, even when they could have left. And a lot of that had to do with their not wanting to abandon their families. If I go running off, I'm 21 years old, I go running off, who's going to plant the garden for my grandma next spring? Who's going to do the things that will help my family survive on the plantation? So most slaves stayed, even when they could have run.
Now, don't just throw that term Underground Railroad out there and leave it. Now, you got young people that...
You don't think they all don't know what the underground...
They don't know.
They think the Underground Railroad was a train that ran underneath... Oh,
like
Lord.
the subway or something.
No. Listen, children. We'll straighten you all out about the Underground Railroad. The people tend to know about Sojourner Truth and a couple of the conductors who know, but the process may not be that well known. There were two Underground Railroads. The Underground Railroad is the name for the process through which slaves were able to run away, primarily to the north, but there was also an Underground Railroad that came south to Florida and to the Bahamas and beyond. What the railroad consisted of was a series of safe houses that if you ran away from your plantation in Orlando, there would be a safe house in Jacksonville. Then there's one in Savannah, going all the way up north until you get to Ohio or into the north. And it was pretty effective. Thousands of slaves got saved through the Underground Railroad going north and south.
So explain to them the Mason-Dixon line so these young people will get some idea of where freedom started.
Well, you tell them what it was. You know what it was.
Well, the Mason-Dixon line was an imaginary line that separated the North from the South. And as a slave, if you got north of the Mason-Dixon line, then you would have reached that location where you no longer have to fear that somebody other than a slave hunter who's trying to track you down would then kill you or enslave you again or whatever.
Correct.
So the idea with the Underground Railroad was all of these safe places that you can get to up until the crossing of that imaginary Mason-Dixon line. But I have a question for you also about these safe houses, safe places, because we got to give credit to good white people. A lot of those locations were homes and barns and whatever storage bins of white people. And if other white people had known that they were doing that, what would have happened to them?
They would have been more likely to run out of the community. But yes, you're quite right. Those safe houses had a lot of support, particularly from Quakers, as we mentioned earlier, but other people who were moved morally to do something to help the slaves. The Underground Railroad that came into Florida ended in Miami. In what's now Miami. For many of the slaves escaping, if you were trying to escape slavery in Georgia, you didn't run to Canada. Well, you may have. People who were trying to escape from South Carolina and Georgia had a good chance of coming south on the Southern Railroad rather than trying to get all the way up to Canada or some northern state. So, we had just a constant stream of escaped slaves coming down the Florida coast, ending up in what's now Miami-Dade County, and then being helped to get to the Caribbean or getting there on their own.
Further in this conversation, we're going to be talking about a number of black men, the roles that they play. So let's take an opportunity now just to mention the name Harriet Tubman. We want to give credit to black women, too. They played a major role.
The conductor on the railroad.
Trying to help us out with this. Yeah. Okay, now tell us about this thing about the big guns. And I know our grandmother informed you of that. So
our great-grandmother told our grandmother who told me about this. When the Civil War ended in Appomattox and then the Grant and Lee ended their conference that ended the war, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Union troops at Appomattox when this ceremony took place. And once it was all over and Lee comes out, makes it clear that the hostilities are over, these Union soldiers started firing their artillery guns as a kind of a celebratory way of indicating that the war was over. And then over several days, gun batteries all up and down the coast would fire their guns once they heard the gun that was fired closest to them. So it was a volley of moving sound down into the South, into the deepest interiors of the South. And that's how the slaves knew that slavery had ended, that the war had been won. And then there's a great celebration and all the thing that came after that. But that's how, if you think about it, if you were a slave in Florida, how would you know that the war was over?
Exactly.
How would you know? And sound traveled faster than anything else they could measure or manipulate at the time. But the way the slaves put it was the day the big gun fired was the day that they were freed, or at least that they knew the war was over.
Now, I'm sure that was somewhat of an effective way of letting them know, remembering that the slaves couldn't read, so even if they printed them in the paper here in the South, the war is over, slaves are free. Mm-hmm. Slaves wouldn't know that. Now, plantation owners aren't going to go back and say, okay, you're free.
Yes, they did.
They did?
Oh, yeah. They typically, yes.
Because that's exactly what my question is. I've been led to understand that there were slaves who remained on the plantation, literally enslaved for months, if not years, because they didn't know. They were so isolated, they didn't know it was over. Nobody told them.
Well, that may have happened in some isolated incidents, but I think it was generally known by the slaves that they were free. And the way that the typical slave owner did it was to assemble the slaves and announce to them, y'all are free now, but you have a choice. You can stay on my place and sharecrop. We can talk about what sharecropping meant, or you can go.
And that is going to lead us into another conversation and another episode about the Great Migration. You got to talk about this.
It's a totally different subject now.
I know.
And all right, but I just want to clarify what I think happened.
Okay.
When slaves found out that they were free, that the slave masters. I'm not sure, Ray, that they were required to tell the slaves that they were free. They probably were. There was probably some requirement. Mm-hmm. And even if the slave masters didn't tell the slaves, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established by the federal government to look after the welfare of the slaves, the Freedmen's Bureau spread out across the South and went to these remote communities and counted the number of people, number of slaves, and what have you. So that was a process for letting people know that they were then free.
Join us next week. We will discuss the history of slavery, Part 2.
I am Dr. Marvin Dunn. I'm the author of several books dealing with black history in Florida. The first book was on the Miami Riot of 1980. Crossing the Bounds was written by myself and Bruce Porter. I've also written Black Miami in the 20th Century, and it deals with the history of lynching in Florida. And my latest book is called A History of Florida Through Black Eyes, and it traces the history of blacks in Florida from the arrival of black people with the Spanish. These books are available on Amazon.
Are you an artist looking for a place to record high-quality vocals to meet a certain standard? Are you looking for a certified audio engineer that was trained to work in any recording environment and proficient in Pro Tools? Are you looking for sound design, music production, movie scores, or production for any multimedia project? What about learning how to produce and operate Pro Tools? All of these things can be accomplished by working with producer AV of Clockwork Track. Stay locked into at Clockwork 305 on IG for updates and further details. To set up a session, AV can be reached at 305-812-9292. Let Clockwork Track service all of your audio production needs.
We'd like to thank our sponsors, Aris Crown All Natural Products and Clockwork Tracks, for providing our podcast music. Special thanks also to our editor, Track 53, as well as HGAB Studios and MRD2 Media.
You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at TBE Unfiltered, or go to our website at tbeunfiltered.com.
And when you do, don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe.
See you next week.